Good morning. Now, this is not my first time in Pueblo. I was here 20 years ago when I was working for the Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company. Well, I'm back. I've got a small trading post up in Denver. My old friend, Sublet, invited me and his nephew, Louis Vasquez, to come to Denver and help him out. You see, this gold rush thing is not new. We had this 10 years ago in California, and I panned for gold for a while. I looked for it, but you know, the real money is made in taking care of the miners. You know, $5 for an apple when it's 25 cents in St. Louis is not bad, and a nickel in New York. So fleecing the gold miners was really the way you get ahead. Well, now, Sublet, he's one of 5 brothers. William and Milton, I knew them. They were part of the 100. Part of General William Hensley's brigade that came out in 1824. Now, I grew up not too far from St. Louis, near St. Charles, about 20 miles north of St. Louis, in a place my father settled that's still called Beckwourth Landing. And it was a quiet place. There wasn't much to do there. We'd come out from Virginia when I was, about 10 or so, and my father started a farm. Now, he had to clear the land because the forest was thick. And he would tell stories about his family growing up in England. His father, Sir Marmaduke Beckwourth, was a baron or a baronet or something. My father tried to explain it to me. And old Marmaduke claimed that we were related, on the wrong side of the blanket, to Henry VIII. But when he looked around and saw his half-black grandchildren, he said, we didn't seem very much like English royalty. Well, now, I'd like to disagree with that. You see, I had 6 wives too, just like Henry. Now, unlike Henry, I had 4 of them at one time. But I didn't chop the heads off of any of them. I want you to know that. Well, Beckwourth Landing was a quiet place, as I said. And as I got to be, about 13 or so, my father thought it was time for me to think about a career, a profession, as he called it, something I could use to make my way in the world. So he took me into St. Louis, where he knew people there. We went to a blacksmith shop owned by a Mr. George Caston, and I was apprenticed to Mr. Caston. And I stayed with him 3, maybe almost 4 years. And I learned to be a blacksmith. Now, you know, working as a blacksmith's apprentice is not very exciting. You get there first thing in the morning, sort of like you people here today. You start the fire. You clean the bellows and you oil the leather sleeves to the bellows. You get the tools out. You make sure they're cleaned and ready. And then, of course, anything that has to be moved around, the iron ingots, wood, coal, you have to bring all that in so it's ready when the blacksmiths come to work. So I learned the trade. I could shoe a horse. I could make locks. I could make the hinges for a door or a gate. Everything metal on the frontier had to be done. Now, St. Louis at the time was a crossroads. We had a lot of people from Mexico. We had a lot of people from Canada, French Canadians. They talk funny. In fact, they still talk funny. I don't understand half of that. Spanish, I do understand some. I lived in Santa Fe for a while. But you have to learn languages. And of course, the Indians came into trade from western Missouri. I met a lot of mountain men. They would come by to get things done, metal pieces on their harnesses, and of course, their guns needed work. And St. Louis became a famous place for gun makers. The Hawkins brothers and the son of Joe Hawkins, they built a real good rifle for the plains. See, rifles at the time from back east, Pennsylvania rifles were long guns, 40-inch barrels, 42-inch barrels, 32 caliber. They were good for hunting in Pennsylvania, where the game was small, but where the game got a little bigger, like bear and buffalo, you needed a gun with a little more wallop. So if you were going to send a lead message somewhere, 58 caliber and 150 grains of powder was a lot better. So they were made in St. Louis as well. And of course, things happened to them. They needed new pieces and new fixings, and the smiths were busy, the gunsmiths. So people would come to the blacksmith to have some parts made. And sometimes the mountain men going west took extra parts. Well, I got to meet a number of them. But you know, blacksmithing is hard work. Anybody here ever worked in a blacksmith shop? Well, no, it's hot. It's hot. It's hard work, carrying lots of things around. So I didn't get on too well with Mr. Kasten. He thought I was spending too much time in the evening going out to taverns, chasing girls, just plain old whooping it up in town. But I always got to work on time in the morning. Now, I'm not going to tell you that sometimes I wasn't a little tired. Well, one day, after he'd seen me out late the night before, now why was he out? He commenced berating me about my lifestyle. He didn't think it was what it ought to be in a good young man. And he picked up a hammer and threw it at me. Well, now I don't lay hands upon others, nor use bad language, and I will not tolerate that being done to me, even when I was an apprentice. Well, I was bigger, stronger than he was, and I didn't like him throwing the hammer at me. So I picked up an anvil and I threw that back at him. Well, that ended my blacksmith career. I went back to my boarding house after we exchanged some more words, and a few minutes later he arrived. And he told the landlady that I was no longer boarding on his account. And I told her I had money, I had saved my pay, and I could pay myself. So some minutes later, a one-armed constable showed up, and I knew why he was there. Mr. Kasten wanted to enforce his contract. Well, I loaded my pistol, walked downstairs. I heard the constable talking, told him who I was, if he was looking for me, that I had no intentions of going anywhere with him or going to the blacksmith shop. Now, he could see I was serious, particularly after I cocked my pistol. Now, he only had one arm. So he excused himself, said he'd be back. Well, of course, I knew he was going to get some help. Another constable, maybe 2 or 3. Young man with a gun was, even in St. Louis, was considered a bit pushy at that time. Especially when he told the constable that he'd kill him if he touched him. I decided I wouldn't wait for the rest of the constables to arrive, and I left. I hid at a friend's house for 3 days. Then I went home, and my father told me I ought to go back, and he was willing to go straighten this out with Mr. Caston, but I told him I didn't want to be a blacksmith. I wanted to do something else. So I worked around the farm for a while until a trading party that was on a peace mission up in northern Illinois came along. They were going up to the Fox River. There was an Army colonel, his brother, who was some kind of businessman, I don't know what, but he was going to see what the opportunities were like. And there was an old mountain man named Moses Harris, who was along with him. Moses could speak sign, and he was very valuable because the Indians in the Fox River Valley didn't speak a language anybody in St. Louis understood. So Moses was the translator. There were 20 people or so that took this boat up the Mississippi. I went along as an extra hand. I could handle the horses, and they of course thought that since I had been a blacksmith's apprentice, I could help take care of the horses. Now they didn't know I wasn't interested in doing any more blacksmith work. But I was a fairly good shot. My father was a hunter, and he taught me to hunt early. So I provided meat for the party. And a peace treaty was made with the Sauk Indians in the Fox River Valley. And mostly because Moses was so good at translating. I liked it there, so I stayed on. The party left after 4 months. I stayed on for about 2 years and hunted in the area, provided meat for some of the immigrants who were living there and setting up their farmsteads. And I enjoyed that life. But I had learned from Moses that being able to handle yourself in more than one language could be important. Once again, those French speakers there, I couldn't understand them very well. But I tried. I could listen to some of it and speak a few words, at least to do some trading, sell my meat. But I came back to St. Louis and I looked Moses up. And Moses was working for a man who was organizing a new company to go to the far west. This was the Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company. And General William Ashley, who was the head of the company, and his partner, Andrew Henry, in 1824 were looking for 100 men. And they called this the Brigade of 100. They wanted 100 young, strong, healthy, adventurous types who wanted to go west to the mountains and seek their fortune. Now, General Ashley was a very shrewd man, and he knew that the other companies that were trading in the West, John Jacob Astor's American Fur Trading Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, all of them wanted to continue west trapping, but the seasons were short. You could trap for 3 or 4 months of the year, but more money could be made if you could trade with the Indians. They lived there all the time, if you could get them to trap. Well, now, General Ashley had a number of interesting men on this first large trip to the far west. Jim Bridger was on that trip. Thomas Fitzpatrick was on that trip. A lot of people you'd hear about later. 2 of the 4 Sublette brothers, Will and Milton, they were on that trip. And he picked me, and you know why? He thought I could help with the horses. He was looking for a free blacksmith. I didn't want to do that. But I was hired on as a horse wrangler. We moved the horses along with us. 100 men, of course, we needed 250, 300 horses so that we could change horses as they got tired. We had pack animals. We didn't have any wagons on those first trips. But the idea that General Ashley had, different from everybody else, he looked at the Hudson's Bay Company and what they were doing out in the Oregon country. He'd heard about them. Now, of course, they had ships that sailed from England out to Oregon. But he thought if he built forts along the trail as far west as Yellowstone, that trading could be done with the Indians along the way, but also you could move supplies out west later as roads were made with wagons, and of course you could bring the fur back. Now the best way to bring the fur back from the far west was to get back to the Missouri River and sail downriver back to St. Louis. And we did that after a while. Well, Moses taught me more sign, and that was useful because I could become one of the translators. But since I was a good shot, and after about 20 days or so, we were out of fresh provisions, 20 days out from St. Louis, I became the wrangler for the hunters. There were 4 or 5 men, 2 or 3 rifles apiece. They'd go out a day or so ahead of the rest of the party. 100 men kick up a lot of dust, as you can imagine, and 200 head of horse. That makes quite a lot of noise. So these hunters would get out a day or so ahead of the main party, and they'd hunt and then bring back fresh meat. Maybe they'd leave one of the hunters and he'd hang deer in trees as it was being dressed until the party caught up. Well, I was loading for one of the hunters one day, and he fired his first rifle, and he missed. He fired his second rifle, and he missed, and he was fumbling to load the second rifle. I had a third one already loaded. Well, I fired, and I hit the target. I brought down a large elk, which would feed our party for several days. So afterwards, the hunter said, well, look, since you're with us and you use a rifle pretty well, why don't you hunt? So I became a hunter. Nobody ever asked me to do any blacksmith work after that. I was happy with that. Well, General Ashley, he caught up with us. The hunting party was out front, and he was trying to find a ford across a small river, but it was running heavy because this was early in the spring, and the water was coming down from the mountains, and his cinch broke. And I didn't know this big, strong general, leader of the whole Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company, a man with the ideas to build these forts all across the West, you know he couldn't swim? Well, I got off my horse, I got in the water, pulled my horse behind me, the horse was swimming with me, and I got out to where General Ashley was caught on a snag, and I told him to hold on to the tail of my horse, and I grabbed him as well, and we swam back to the shore. He was very thankful. We hadn't talked much. I was fairly junior in the party, so I wouldn't have dinner with the general every night by the campfire like some of the older mountain men. And we talked a little bit, and he gave me a small ivory-handled knife that his wife had given him as a present when he left. And Moses gave me my first Indian name. I was called White-Handled Knife. I was very proud of this knife, not because of the knife itself, but what it represented, that I'd saved General Ashley, and he said I'd saved the whole expedition. Of course, he thought since it was his expedition, we couldn't get by without him. You know, generals are like that. They're sort of big, sometimes loud, older, a little fat. You know what I'm talking about? Are generals still like that? Yeah, I guess they are. Well, so a good friend of Moses was a man named Caleb Greenwood. And Caleb and I also became friends. Caleb was married to a Crow woman. The Aspo Sukli is the name of these people. And they're not the Crow, although that's how you've got them in books. They're actually the Sparrowhawk people. They don't call themselves Crow. As Americans were moving west, you would ask one tribe about what was in front of them. Is there a river ford we can get over? Is there a pass we can cross over the mountains? How soon do the snows come in the winter? And who are those people who live across the river? Well, we asked the Blackfeet about the Sparrowhawk people. who are those people who live across the river? And the Blackfeet told us, well, they're the crow. You know, crows are birds that steal from other birds. They take things out of the nest. They're dirty. They're not very smart. Well, what do you expect when you ask their enemies who they are? We were trading with the crow, and Caleb, whom I said was married to a crow woman, told stories. He's a big storyteller, and he liked tall tales. And since the Blackfeet and the Cheyenne were enemies of the crow, and all of these people raided each other for horses, he told the crow, several crow women, that I was a young crow boy taken away as a small child and eventually raised by the people that belonged to the red-headed chief, what they call General Clark, the governor of Missouri, the great red-headed chief. And that I had come back to bring great medicine and great strength from America. Well, now, Caleb was a man that they knew, they trusted, and this was a good story. And of course, lots of children had been taken away by the Cheyenne and the Blackfeet, and it was possible that they could be rescued by the Americans back east, and maybe that was true. So several women came over and took a look at me. I had a scar on my forehead. It wasn't the hammer at the blacksmith shop. He missed. And I had a mole on my right hand. One of the women recognized that scar and the mole as belonging to her small son who had been taken away years before. And I was immediately accepted into the Crow tribe as one of them who had been brought back by the Americans. Well, the family I was adopted into belonged to one of the minor chiefs, Big Bull, and Big Bull's two sons, who were very important young warriors, were a member of the Dog Soldier clan. So not only did I have a new mother and father, two sisters, two brothers, but I had a warrior clan that I would be invited to join if I could show the requisite strength. Well, you have to be given a name. And names among the Plains Indian people are very important. Your parents give you a name when you're born. And then perhaps you do something as a child, as a teenager, that other people recognized. I was, as a young man, a fast runner. So I was called at first by the Crow people, the Sparrowhawk people, I was called Fast Antelope. That was my first name, the name I was given. And Fast Antelope was invited to join the Crow Dog Soldier clan. And the concept of coup and names were explained to me. Counting coup was how a warrior achieved the benefices of promotion within the clan. Now, counting coup, killing an enemy is coup, but you don't have to kill an enemy to count coup. If you charged into battle and you touched the enemy with your weapon, that was coup. If you saved one of your fellow warriors in a fight, he was unhorsed and you picked him up and put him on the back of your horse and you rode away, that was counting coup. So this could be done in a lot of ways. You demonstrated your capability, your medicine, by ultimately leading a horse stealing raid. Now remember, a blacksmith's apprentice, I knew a little bit about horses. Now I didn't know I was going to have to grow up and steal them. But a horse was wealth on the plains for the Plains Indians. If you've got 100 miles to go and you can walk at 3 miles an hour, it's going to take you a while to get where you're going. But if you're on a horse that can move further and faster and carry the things that you need to take with you, you are obviously better off. Now, I assume some of you have read the Declaration of Independence. And it says all men are created equal. Well, now the person who wrote that has never been afoot in a battle where everybody else is on a horse. If you think everybody's equal, you get off your horse and see what fighting is like when somebody rides by with a tomahawk. Well, stealing horses is important. So after counting coup, I was given the opportunity to lead a horse stealing raid. Now I had an advantage. I'd come from further east than any of the Crow had ever been. So I knew small canyons, bows in rivers, depressions from coming out west where some of these other people kept their horses. So I could lead a raid to steal horses from the Cheyenne. Now the Cheyenne were legendary as horse stealers and as fighters. In fact, if you listen to the Crow around the campfire at night, the Cheyenne were all 10 feet tall, had 3 arms, and could swing 5 tomahawks at one time. So they were barely built up. So stealing 100 horses, 150 horses on a night raid from the Cheyenne made me very important in the Dog Soldier clan. And after several of these raids, I was made one of the minor chiefs. And because they thought I was very wise, remember medicine, wisdom, luck, those are all tied together, your wisdom, I was given the name Buffalo Calf, because buffalo calves are considered very wise. They come in, if you've ever looked into the eyes of a buffalo, of course, if you get that close, you're probably thinking a lot of other things than how much wisdom they're demonstrating. But at least the buffalo calf, the Indian people thought, demonstrated wisdom. Well, I lived with the Crow for 7 years. In 1837, I got word that one of my sisters was getting married, and in the spring, and that if I could be back over the winter that year, I'd be welcome to attend the wedding. So I did go back, and of course what I didn't know, the news, was that the United States was at war in Florida. Well, I attended the wedding, and the Army was recruiting scouts. And a company of scouts, most of which were mountain men from the Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company, but some from the American and some independent trappers were also invited to join. There were 30 of us all together. And we sailed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And then we were to get on a Navy ship and go on to Florida. Well, I got yellow fever in New Orleans, and I stayed there for 2 months until I was better. But when I got to Florida, my exploits were talked about by these mountain men who knew me to the Army, and I was made not only a scout, but I was made a message carrier. Florida, at that time, I guess it still is, a long peninsula. And of course, the Navy would have to sail around Florida to get messages and supplies and equipment to support the Army. Well, Colonel Taylor, Colonel Scott, Winfield Scott, they were later generals in the Mexican War. I got to know them both. I carried messages from their headquarters across Florida. 2 or 3 of the old mountain men who were also scouts, I would form a small party with them, and we could ride across Florida in a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, to move messages, and it took more than a week. And if the weather were bad, hurricane season, perhaps longer to get around Florida. So I scouted for the Army. I enjoyed that. I did that for 18 months or so. 39, I went back to St. Louis. And by then, General Ashley had sold the company. The Sublet brothers owned part of it, and some other gentlemen from back east had invested, and they owned the rest of the company. And I wasn't particularly well known to them. So I didn't think it made a lot of sense to go back into the mountains. I did not want to live with the Indians any longer. The life was just too violent. And It was stressful. It took a lot out of me. Well, people were starting to go to Oregon and California. Now, living here in Colorado, you probably find that hard to believe, people going to Oregon and California. But I decided there might be opportunity out there. So I went to California. I did some hunting, did some trapping, but mostly I had learned from General Ashley that the real money was in business. Now, I didn't tell you, but while I worked and lived with the Crow, I was still part of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company. And the deal I made with them is that I would keep the peace between the Crow and the Blackfeet and the Cheyenne, who were ancestral enemies. They wanted to fight each other more than anything else. And I would at least keep the Crow trapping all year long, so there would be more fur for the Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company to pick up. Well, I developed a reputation, and I also made a deal with the American Fur Trading Company. Now, Thomas Boner, an itinerant judge that I met while I was living in California, wrote a book about me. Are there any lawyers here? Well, I learned not to like lawyers, no personal offense, ma'am. But Bonner was an itinerant judge, a justice of the peace, and he promised me half of the fee for the book he was writing. Well, the Harper brothers published it. We spent about a year working on the book. I eventually had a ranch up in the Sierras. And this ranch was a way station, a supply point, and a place where immigrants crossing the Sierras could rest. I had set up my ranch shortly after the Donner Party crossed the Sierra, the Donner Pass, which was 8,300 feet. Well, the pass I found, the Beckwourth Pass, was 5,224 feet. So when there was deep snow in the Sierra, the pass where I lived and set up the ranch had perhaps some snow, but rainy, muddy, but wagons could still get across the road that I helped build. Are there any politicians here as well? Well, the city fathers in Marysville, had they listened to me, Marysville could have been the capital of California. The city fathers in Marysville promised to pay me $4,000 if I improved the road on the pass. So I improved the road in 1854, over the winter, 54, 55. But there was a fire in Marysville, and the records burned down, and of course they needed to spend all their money on doing other things. So they didn't have any money to pay me. So on this small ranch that I set up, I got a forge. And wouldn't you know that I started doing blacksmithing work again? But this time I owned the shop and I had people to help. So when wagons came through, I had a herd of cattle. I would take the old cow that was tied onto the wagon, and I'd sell the family a new cow, at a profit, of course. When they realized how difficult it was getting over the mountains, and that Grandma's sewing machine was heavy, and forcing the wagon to dig in deep in the ruts in the road, I'd take it off their hands for a small price. I'd sell them grain, sometimes seed, so that they had something to plant when they arrived in California. But it made a tidy business. So eventually, I would work on the ranch, keep the forge going over the summer, and I'd live in San Francisco or Sacramento, which was then developing under Mr. Sutter, during the wintertime. It gets cold up in the Sierras, and I was getting a little older. Well, the politics in the country were starting to change. Lots of things were going on. Things were divisive. I thought war might be coming, and who knows, the Army might need scouts. And then the gold rush came along this year, so I came back to Colorado. I'd been here before with one of the Sublette brothers. And as I said, he asked me to come back and join Louis Vasquez in setting up a trading post in Denver. Now, you might have some questions about my life, and I'd be happy to answer them if I can. I assume some of you are new, and I don't know, are there any gold prospectors here? Nobody's prospecting for gold. Well, if you are, you come up to Denver, I will sell you shovels, pans, we'll build wagons for you, anything you need at my trading post. But what questions might I be able to answer?